This is Tiara speaking. Welcome back, everyone. This next session is a multifaceted discussion on digital design. We would like to welcome Dr. Make Marate. Make is an assistant professor at Michigan State University. Their research fosters inclusion in the practices of experts and the design of software systems by centering the experiences of people with disabilities. We welcome Rolando Mendez. Rolando is the Director of Education at Teach Access, where he creates initiatives and resources to help educators integrate accessibility into their teaching and learning curricula. We also welcome Dr. Venkatesh Potluri. Venkatesh is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan's School of Information. Venkatesh understands accessibility gaps experienced by developers with disabilities in expert domains such as AI and data science. His team develops new ways to program and contributes improvements to popular developer tools. Welcome, everyone. This is Tiara speaking. I'm very excited about this discussion. Again, we have a very short time, so I am going to jump right into it. The first question I'm going to pose is to Rolando. Rolando, can you tell us about what the accessibility skills gap is and what opportunities you see in addressing it? Also, what challenges are driving these efforts to address the accessibility skills gap?
Hi, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. This is Rolando speaking. I'm a Latino man with black hair and pepper bear. I'm wearing a Teach Access blue collar shirt and big glasses. And to answer the first question about what is the accessibility skills gap, I would like to define accessibility skills as the ability to purposefully create, review, and procure digital products that are both in line with WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and are fully usable by people with disabilities. And there's an accessibility skills gap, and this is the gap between the demand for digital accessibility skills in the workplace and the supply of workers who are knowledgeable and skilled in accessibility. And in 2018, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology conducted a survey and revealed there was a big gap of people entering the workforce and not having these skills. Then in the fall of 2022, Teach Access conducted a follow-up survey, which was expanded to include more diverse sectors and locations. And this space of 4 years, the gap still was like wide, right? And some of the findings and related to this accessibility skills gap is that students are not learning these skills in school, unfortunately. And most of this education happens on the workplace. And it usually happens like as a person, I'm interested in learning more about accessibility, or I encounter a situation where I need to learn about accessibility. There's also an increased awareness of the importance of accessibility and accessibility skills, yet there's still a need for structure in organizations and strategy around accessibility. Also, a part of what the survey revealed is that there's a disconnect between an intent and action. So we say we do care about accessibility. We say we do value accessibility skills, but the organisms, the positions, or the way we're structured as an organization, it's not necessarily supportive of embedding accessibility throughout the organization. There was also a follow-up study we did in a partnership with University of Phoenix, and kind of highlighted the same information as well. And some of the opportunities we see at Teach Access at addressing the accessibility skills gap is first is the right thing to do for organizations. Reaching out to all of your constituents and your customers is one of the things that we should do. We should build places, products, services for everyone, and they should be usable by everyone, and everyone could interact with them. Another thing is that accessibility is a standard in many industries and is becoming a standard in others. And some recent rulings like the Department of Justice guidance on Title II of the American with Disabilities Act is impacting educational institutions. So educational institutions, higher educational institutions across the United States have seen the need of equipping people with the skills. We recently saw the European Accessibility Act enter into effect last week or about a week or so. And we see that uh, organizations in Europe, European Union, as well as other organizations conducting businesses in the European Union need to make their products accessible. So this is something that is being required um, everywhere, not just a part of the United States and in some industries, but it's getting some traction there. And some of regarding the challenges, these efforts, driving these efforts, I think it's one of the challenges is workforce demand is outpacing education. So people are getting out there. We have seen an increase in the past couple of years of students having this fundamental knowledge and entering the workforce, but still the demand is outpacing the educational efforts. Also, in terms of education in higher ed mostly, there's limited exposure. So students learn about accessibility in maybe one specific course. And oftentimes this course is an elective. So it's not something mainstream or that every student has access to. And we believe that everyone from every discipline should have a fundamental knowledge about disability and accessibility. There's still also many misconceptions about accessibility and in our experience, we're talking experience within higher education in terms of thinking of accessibility as a checklist that we go through and just we're done. We don't have to do anything in it, or misconception that we do not have to involve people with disabilities in the process, and we can make this based on assumptions or on things that we think we know about how people use technology and what their needs are. Also, misconceptions about that accessibility is a one and done thing, but the truth is accessibility is an ongoing process. And there's another one about only applying to technical disciplines. So some of the conversations with higher education faculty and students, people think that it only applies to computer science or maybe human computer interaction or software engineers. And it's something that every discipline has one way or another needs knowledge about it. We also see some of the challenges in lack of infrastructure regarding funding, technology, knowledge, and the ability to teach about accessibility, right? And then inaccessibility is still widespread, unfortunately.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much. Rolando, I heard you say everyone needs accessibility education, but that currently is not the case. Venkatesh, I want to invite you to address this same question regarding this accessibilities skills gap and what we can do to address it.
This is Venkatesh speaking. Thank you, Tiara, and thank you, Rolando, for such a comprehensive explanation of what the skills gap is looking like today. I do want to kind of go deeper into the education aspect of what's contributing to the accessibility skills gap, right? So as Rolando was mentioning, a lot of times, how students encounter accessibility in the technical disciplines, at least, is through maybe if they take a class in software engineering or web design or like human computer interaction, right? And it's like through this one lecture that probably focuses on it. Yeah, so I think seeing accessibility spread across, multiple aspects of education, focusing on computing, for example, because I think all of computing is a fundamentally human experience, and so is disability. Kind of thinking about how we can introduce accessibility so that, a broader set of students with a broader set of skill sets are familiar, right? People who might then go into leadership positions who have the power to make decisions, right? About how much amount of resources we want to invest in accessibility and so on. It just becomes this thing that becomes second nature once we have more people training.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you. Orlando, I'm going to ask you another question. Can you share a successful example of cross-sector collaborations that have advanced accessibility education?
Yes, this is Ronald speaking. Uh, Teach Access was founded as a cross-sector organization when people from academia, industry, disability advocacy groups got together in a room and saw there was a skill gap and that we needed to do more to get more, accessibility education to more people. So most of the work that we do is based on that cross-sector collaboration, but I can mention a couple of recent examples where we have collaborated with either industry, disability advocacy organizations, or academia to advance accessibility educations. For example, last year we worked with Microsoft's accessibility team to release a course on accessible design in practice. And we did a 5 module course on how to do like screen reader support, keyboard navigation, color and contrast, resize and reflow, and annotations for accessibility. And this course was made freely available to all students through the Microsoft Learn platform. We also, last year, we also collaborated with Every Learner Everywhere. They're a nonprofit organization that focuses on equity in education. And then we built, with their support, a toolkit on AI and accessibility and some of the considerations that people in higher education should have when adopting artificial intelligence or when considering incorporating artificial intelligence, and to think of their impact, the barriers it might create or the new opportunities it might create for people with disabilities within higher education. Most recently, 2 weeks ago, we concluded a Fellows for Accessible Media program with the CAPTA Foundation. They're audio description, audiovisual accessibility company. And what we did, we do have a fellow program where we take faculty and staff from different institutions across the United States and Puerto Rico. And over the course of a year, we teach them about accessibility, accessible design, and how they can teach about these topics to the students. So after they were done with the program, we created this follow-up program so they could focus more on audio description and how they could teach about audio description to their students. Other resources that we put out, for example, this week we released the fundamental concepts and skills, and this is back when we were founded, many accessibility experts kind of outlining the topics when we said like fundamental knowledge is skill. What does it mean? So they outlined these topics at these areas or knowledge areas that people needed to know about accessibility. So that was done like 8 years ago. So we, with the help of people in United States, in European Union, industry, academia, disability advocacy groups, we then uh, updated this to become a more robust resource that could help faculty from different disciplines start talking about accessibility in their courses, regardless of their level of knowledge about accessibility. The same thing it was done with Why Teach and Why Learn accessibility resources, which kind of highlights why should people learn about accessibility or why they should teach about accessibility, whether it is like in a higher educational context or in the workforce. As part of workforce development, and finally, like the hiring skills toolkit, which we worked directly with industry and accessibility professionals, and kind of like how do accessibility skills and knowledge look like in different roles, and what kind of questions you can ask for that role when you're hiring someone, and what are the things that you might need to consider to prove that they have this knowledge.
This is Tiara speaking. That's really good, Rolando. And if you send our team some of those resources that you referenced, we'll be sure to get those out to the participants. Thank you. So far, we have talked about educating young designers and content creators on accessibility, but I understand that the actual tools and platforms used by developers need to be accessible as well. Venkatesh, I'm going to pose this next question to you. What does accessibility look like in the digital technology design and development process, and how would you like it to change?
This is Venkatesh speaking. Thank you for that great question. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit. First, I'll talk a little bit about how accessibility looks like in the digital technology and design space, right? So what happens most often is that, somebody, maybe a user who happens to have a disability, tries to use a product, finds it inaccessible, makes the developers aware of the fact, and then the teams take notice and then realize that they, want to kind of invest in accessibility. Some other times, there are a few, situations where teams are aware of the fact that accessibility, needs to be done from the get-go. But what happens in the first example that I've given you is that once, the teams realize that accessibility needs to happen, it sometimes can already be too late, right? There could be a lot of the lack of resources to be invested in accessibility. Sometimes organizations attribute it to not having the necessary, people with the necessary skills, which is also true. And then, as Rolanda was pointing out earlier, right, a lot of learning happens on the job, and then you have one or two people who are experts in the team on making the thing accessible, and all of the responsibility just falls on those one or two people, right, to ensure that things remain accessible. In teams where accessibility is thought of from the get-go, it's situation is better, slightly different, right, where there are engineering decisions, design decisions, and resource allocation decisions that are made from the get-go that account for the fact that the end product needs to be accessible. And honestly, it becomes much simpler, right? It becomes much simpler. It becomes more natural, and the end outcome is also much more refined and polished. Um, all of this sounds great. But one thing that I would like to see more, and I would like to see more on how, changing landscape of accessibility is that we need to have more experts with disabilities in the teams as well, right? Let's say if you're building an intelligent system, there are maybe hiring experts who have the necessary AI and data science skills who also happen to have a disability, right? That I think would really change how we are looking at accessibility. And really, if we if we put people with disabilities in positions of power where they have the ability to create, I think the world becomes better for everybody, right? So one other thing that also happens as an effect of this is that we will see tools of different types, becoming accessible. A lot of times, people with disabilities are considered to be end users of technology. So you will notice that developer tools, which is the tools that are used to build like computing systems or the technologies that we use, are not accessible. Or internal tools like, the compensation portal for your company, or the pay slips themselves, or the benefit systems. All of these internal tools do not end up being accessible. Once you start hiring people with disabilities, once organizations start to have more disabled talent in their workforce, the organization automatically becomes more inclusive and better for everybody. And sometimes with these enterprise tools, especially, you will also see cascading effects. If an enterprise software that helps a company manage their internal processes becomes accessible, that translates automatically to another organization that might be using a very similar kind of technology as well. So yeah, in summary, I think having more people with disabilities in positions of power, and also in roles that enable creation, not just as end users, would, I think, really change the accessibility landscape for people with disabilities and improve technology for everyone.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Venkatesh. So the two notes I heard from you were more experts with disabilities on design teams and in positions of power. And I also heard you kind of hint at the fact that accessibility is all of our responsibility and it shouldn't just fall on just a limited amount of individuals or one or two people. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to pose this next question to Meg. Make what are the risks of leaving accessibility out of the early stages of AI and machine learning development, and why should this be a priority from the very start?
Thank you, Tiara. This is Meg speaking. Was this question intended for Venkatesh, maybe?
I'm sorry, this is Tiara speaking. Yes, you are correct. Venkatesh, that is actually your question. Um, what are the risks? I'm going to repeat it. What are the risks of leaving accessibility out of the early stages of AI and machine learning development? And why must it be a priority from the start?
Yes, this is a great question, and thank you for asking, right? So I'll give you a few examples of what happens when you leave out accessibility in machine learning systems and pipelines from the get-go, right? You will have sensors that fail to detect people with disabilities when they're in the room and turn off lights if they're on a wheelchair. Or you will also have elevator doors that might be closing down faster, even if you happen to be slightly slow in like doing whatever you're doing, right? These are just a few examples. What I'm trying to say here is that you will find technologies that are biased towards even the slightest of variation in the human experience and human ability, right? When you don't account for accessibility in like machine learning systems or AI systems from the get-go.
Mm.
What you will get, though, if you happen to consider accessibility from the beginning, is systems that are automatically less biased, right? You will get, the YouTube automatic live captions that so many of us enjoy. There's also people with disabilities who are to, be thanked for providing that, building those capabilities in its earliest forms, for example, right? Captioning systems in general that a lot of us enjoy, right? Like our a result of accessibility, they get better. Yeah, so these are like some ways, right? And these risks are just from the user facing level, but there are like deeper problems as well. If a consequence of not looking at accessibility from the get-go is that there is research that showed that the use of generative AI systems in hiring, right, is known to be biased against candidates who have disabilities who are equally qualified as somebody who may not have a disability, because these AI systems think that words like accessibility or like focusing on some advocacy efforts are a quote unquote distraction from the candidate's like original a candidate's primary job function, which is not true, right? So I think, yeah, these are some of the bigger harms, and there are decisions that get made with AI systems on who gets benefits, how people are perceived by computing systems. All of these are not capable. All of these systems will not be capable of accounting for even the slightest variation in human experiences and human abilities.
This is Tara speaking. Thank you so much for sharing that, Venkatesh. My next question is for Make. Now that digital technologies pervade most aspects of our lives, how should we expand the definition of digital accessibility?
Thank you, Tiara. This is Meg speaking. That's a great question. So I think nowadays most and sort of more and more of our daily interactions are occurring digitally, right? Whether it is speaking to our family and friends, whether it's interacting with doctors and other sort of health professionals, public service officials, banks, any kind of institution now has a digital interface, right? And so to begin with, I think creating accessible tech sort of across sectors, as well as teaching developers, designers, and leaders about accessibility, I think has become more necessary than ever before. And this, goes to sort of what Venkatesh and Rolando were speaking about, where the goal is to ensure that accessibility is a key consideration from the start of the development of any technology, and sort of, is sort of woven into the whole process of technology deployment, design, iteration, and so on. But I also think that's only sort of scratching the surface. I think there is another sort of hard problem to be addressed, and that is what I call the last mile of accessibility, which actually means getting accessible technology into the hands of marginalized people, right? Where even if sort of banks and other companies develop accessible technologies, how do we make sure that people who already don't have access to technologies can still make use of them in good ways, right? And there are a lot of resource limitations and access gaps, sort of both in terms of the internet access or other kinds of resource access that prevents people from even getting their hands on technology to begin with. One study we did, for example, looked at the case of mobile banking apps, right? And so these are often apps that are built to be ADA compliant from the ground up. So they have accessibility features built into them. And so technically, theoretically speaking, right, we have enabled accessibility by building this technology. But what happens on the ground is that often visually impaired people and other kinds of people whose human differences are visually apparent, right, are not given access to these technologies at all. So often your account will need like a special sort of indicator to approve you to be able to use your account on a mobile app. And bank officials will not make that happen because they don't believe that you can use a smartphone, for example, right? And so a lot of this problem here has to do with experts who are already part of the system, who mean well in most cases, because they're doing this from a protectionist space, right? They want to make sure that your bank account does not get messed up or no wrong transactions are carried out without you knowing about it. But it comes from a place of fundamental sort of lack of awareness and knowledge about accessibility and about the capabilities of people with disabilities, right? And so I think there is a huge problem where if the people who are responsible for making technologies available are the ones preventing access, how do we overcome that barrier? And so I think beyond educating designers and developers, I think the existing workforce across sectors also needs to be targeted through various educational interventions. And in our case, actually, we found that blind participants had to prove to officials that they could navigate other apps on their smartphone or even the bank's own app to show that they are capable of using this technology, and only then were they granted access, right? And in order for that to happen, they first needed to be extremely skilled in using their device. They need to have the confidence to argue with officials, right? And all of this comes with a lot of privilege and is only possible for certain kinds of people. So I think keeping in mind this sort of last mile, what I call, of accessibility is super important going forward.
Wow, this is Tiara speaking. Thank you for sharing that. Make, you really gave us a lot to consider. I do want to ask you one other question. How should we rethink access given the proliferation of data-centric technologies and platforms?
Yeah, thank you, Tiara. This is Meg speaking. So I think Venkatesh partly addressed this question, which was about, how do we include disability in the process of designing data-centric and AI technologies? But again, I think there is a separate aspect, which is, now that there is so much data available and around us, right, collected about us all the time, available to patients and doctors and so on, how can we make this data accessible to disabled people in ways that they can understand, right? And I'm going to focus particularly on, say, health data, right? Where a lot of devices these days are implanted in people. And so they're continuously recording data about a person's health. But usually the interfaces are not made available to the patient at all, or the interface is so complicated that the patient can't really understand what's being shown to them, right? And so they can't make sense of their own health data in a clinical context. There is one exception in that, things like the Apple Watch and Fitbits now make personal health data available to people, but it doesn't directly translate to a medical context still or any kind of expert professional context. So I think the big challenge here is how to make that data accessible, and particularly when it's not so one dimension is making the data understandable to people, right? So patient facing or lay facing interfaces. The other aspect is particularly when it comes to sensitive data, to using which decisions are made, right? So in the government or in the hospital or in medicine, there are also a lot of concerns around data privacy and protection and making sure that the data is not misused by the wrong people, but also that it doesn't scare people, right? So for example, if you see the result of a heart rate monitor and it shows some incorrect or sort of some alarming pattern, then is that really something that the patient should be concerned about? Or is it something that is an artifact because the patient was walking across the room, right? So a lot of times interpreting data requires the presence of experts in some way. And so how to make that happen while also making sure that the data is visible and accessible to the people whose data it is. And so I think this is another big sort of aspect where the government, healthcare systems, other kinds of industry professionals, community organizers, as well as disabled people, I think we all need to work together to make such an accessible data ecosystem happen.
Mhm. This is Tiara speaking. That is really good, Meg. Thank you so much for sharing that enlightening perspective. And thank you to all of our panelists for your expertise and thought-provoking comments. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for this discussion. All of your perspectives were so interesting. We really could have spoken to each of you probably all day. And I would love to invite you back for a future forum to kind of dive more in depth into some of the topics that we explored. One recurring theme that seems to be essential is the need for incorporating accessibility from the very beginning of any design process. So I hope that everyone in our audience was taking notes regarding that. We are now going to have a brief break until 10:25 a.m. when we will resume with a presentation by Sara Hendren on how to make our programs more accessible. Please feel free to stay logged in and we will see you back at 10:25 a.m. Thank you.